Okay. So, so what I really like about this screening format is that, as opposed to an installation, you kind of trap everyone into one room, and everyone has seen exactly the same thing. So I think that's even if we perceive the works differently, I think it's a really nice starting point for a conversation after. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that all of you are also invited into this conversation. We'll talk for maybe 40 minutes, and then I'll open up for questions from the audience. So you can start preparing. I mostly want to talk about these three works, but I have one a bit more general question to begin with. And I read that both of you have background in music writing, and as a musician. And a lot of the works that you have made have been films. So I'm a bit curious about why and how you started working with moving images, and also why you decided to work as a group rather than as individual artists, I guess.
Maybe I can say a few words. I think the idea of working as a group is a kind of it's a kind of critique of the idea of the individual artist.
Yeah.
That's not a critique of this or that artist. It's more the form and the idea and the aspiration of the individual artist. It's the idea that the individual artist is not up to the task of, is not adequate to the multiple crises that one encounters. So it's to announce a break with a kind of normative idea of an artist, and to say something is wrong. Something has gone wrong. That's why we have to gather together around this crisis, and we have to bear witness to it and not forget it, and keep the texture and the tonality of crisis alive. And as soon as you announce yourself as more than one, you make all kinds of trouble for, the kind of normative expectations. So that's a lot of the reason to do that work. And the question of moving image is, as you can see, it's never separate from all of the other questions. Moving image is in a relation of discrepant articulation with sound and with voice, with noises. And the question is to, as we like to say, to build an interscalar vehicle, to build a vehicle that's capable of moving through the scales of what it is you are trying to get traction on. And that's what moving images, that's what it does for us. It offers the opportunity to open the scales of a dilemma, of a quandary, of something that confronts us.
I would also say that the bourgeois singular artist subject was invigorated by the likes of Charles Saatchi and others in the creation of the Young British Artists movement, which was repulsive at the time. It seemed a kind of extension of Cool Britannia, which produced horrors like Oasis and other kind of British horror stories. And Tracy Emin and her silly bed and all of that rubbish seemed to kind of literally just sort of take a big dump on, or an attempt to take a dump on, the history of new media practices that were emerging in music and emerging in, film. So I grew up with a, obsession with bands, television, and cinema. And the idea of new media felt like technology at the time, or what was, becoming the internet. So these worlds of sort of cool, the repulsion that one felt with Cool Britannia, and the kind of reignition of a kind of white supremacist cultural agenda, which it did feel like at the time, was at odds with the history of Black and Asian collectives, miners' unions, film collectives that had been emerging over the 80s with the creation of platforms like Channel 4. Yeah. And I grew up watching television, from the age of 0, glued to the screen, but glued to good psychedelic, crazy children's television, not, ridiculous Pixar, whatever, which is also can be good. But it was a reaction to this sense of, okay, well, no, we're not equipped to deal with the crisis, but we're not equipped because we're not white. And also we are not, I hate using these terms because everyone uses them in such, as kind of weapons, but, class, a certain kind of background in the sort of art world meant, that you were upper class, British, white. So meaning that you also had a lot of money at your disposal somehow, somewhere, due to inheritance or whatever. So the sense that we wanted to build a world also wasn't new. It also emerged from a long history of I would say, the multi-ethnic left in the UK for 200 years, groups and collectives of all different kinds. Also, people that I grew up with were in London, groups of, Jewish radicals who were, they didn't think of themselves as radicals, they just thought of themselves as human beings. They were communists, and they were, friends of my grandmother who was a communist, and they were involved in particular women's movements. And so I grew up with this very open house atmosphere of kind of people from different cosmopolitans who were critiquing the West from within the Imperium. Critiquing colonialism from within the Imperium. So this felt like a dignified thing to take up, and an important thing to carry on with, in our lifetimes. And to think of this inheritance of film and video and our fascinations and our obsessions as tools and as material to think with. And sound and music, because Kojo and I came together basically a lot, based on a lot of our affinities with different kinds of forms of music. So I was a musician for some time, Kojo was writing about music, but we were all consumed by music of our generation. Clubs were our churches, and, even though I don't like churches. So the sense that music also provided you with a space of non-representation, where the representation of ethnicities could be easily captured and performed, or, music allowed for a destabilization of those images. And
Yeah,
I think that's why we were so drawn to sound.
I think that's also a good place to start talking about the first film, Be Silent for the Ears of God Are Everywhere. And I think of these three, at least that was the work that I hadn't seen before looking through your catalog for this screening. And I thought it was really intriguing because it, in a way, so you have this obsession in the 60s and 70s with Indian culture that you also refer to in the film with Pasolini and Jimi Hendrix and all that. And as I understood it, it's both kind of this critique of this obsession, this Indomania thing with hippie culture and basically Orientalism, but also at the same time it feels like an expression of diasporic culture and creativity, where you also juxtapose these images, different images, and then use words and fonts and so maybe you can speak about that duality, like belonging to a diaspora and also experiencing this, witnessing Orientalism, and if that was some kind of motivation to make this work.
I mean, I have never trusted, I prefer to stay in a state of always ambivalence, because all those people who were following gurus, which I grew up with because my grandmother was grew up in the Theosophical Society, as well as being a leader of the Indian Communist Women's Movement. She was also grew up in the Theosophical Society with figures such as Annie Besant, if anyone knows who she is. She was a theosophist, she was a suffragette, she came to live in India with Colonel Leadbeater and Madame Blavatsky to create the Theosophical Society, but my grandmother was taught by her, and that's a whole story. But then my mother was a physicist, brought up in this kind of world of Indian freedom fighters, and came to the UK and had to deal with all this racism, of course, even though she was extremely attractive and extremely clever, and she found solace amongst all these people who were following this 14-year-old guru called Guru Maharaji, who was teaching people to turn the senses inward and experience inner bliss. And so I grew up inside stadiums, houses, cinemas, ashrams in London. I grew up with worlds within worlds of devotees, people singing devotional music, which, in like West Coast, Californian funksters singing devotional music to this guru who was in Ali Pali in 1972 on a podium of flowers with Mickey Mouses and Mahatmas and throwing Mars bars to the audience. And I was like, wow, these adults really seem like children, So at the same time, though, I mean, that's a whole other story, but I told Kojo all these stories, and we were both became kind of fascinated by, I suppose, the ambivalence of when, anti-imperialism as proper kind of, as an action performed by the non-West upon the West through, as Leela Gandhi writes, gestures of oppositionality. This infiltration of oppositionality, like hybridity or the journey inwards, towards states of inner consciousness. It seemed very interesting to me at the time that, you'd go to school and there would be extreme racism, structural racism, but then you'd go to this other world in the evening across London to watch all these devotees meditating, singing, talking about their experience of bliss and India and this guru and all the rest of it. And then you'd think, well, wait a minute. So the people who are devotees are also not understanding the fact that they have their children in really racist schools in the 70s, right? So this was a contradiction which kind of bothered me or didn't bother me. I just became toughened up to it. I just was at school asking children if they'd ever experienced inner light. And the children were like, what are you talking about? And, but I think this oppositional energies of the non-Western, as anti-imperialists critiquing imperialism, there have always been groups, individuals who have renounced, I would say, the privileges, as Leela Gandhi says, of imperialism, and have elected an affinity with victims of their own expansionist cultures. So, one could sort of look at these as sort of minor forms of anti-imperialism that emerged in Europe, and I would say particularly in Britain, in London, minor forms of, which were benign, okay? I don't see them as I rebelled against it all, but they have been emerging since the end of the 19th century. And these, I would say, these internalized forms of anti-imperialism productively complicates our perspective of a colonial encounter. I think the bringing the colonial history of British Empire to closer proximity with the British nation. This is what people were doing. They were bringing the gurus were bringing that back home to the UK. And I think this was a kind of cosmopolitanism that was going on in a city like London, where you had, you had all these different forces that were all at play, that were all producing, I would say, I wouldn't call it so much Orientalisms. I would call it, I just would like to stay with the idea of the empire being brought home in some way.
Yeah.
Mm. I think, following on from that, the text that Anjali is referring to, that the theorist Leela Gandhi wrote a really important book called Effective Communities. It's a quite an influence coming out of this. I'm not sure we'd read it at the time, but subsequently read it. And what Leela Gandhi is doing is effectively going back to that moment when Marx and Engels, in London, pose a question to socialists. Which path? The utopian path or the scientific path? Which path? And they, of course, opt for the scientific path. And the utopian path is the path of, the vegetarians, the sandal-wearing anti-vivisection,
and the
queer, Edward Carpenter, the queer, the spiritualist, the theosophist, and Marx and Engels say, no, we're not having that. And in a way, Leela Gandhi is going back to that, to that utopian socialist moment. And in a way, Indomania is a good term. We talked about it in terms of indophilia. So what you see in the 60s and 70s, what Anjali grew up in, is, another wave of indophilia, which in a way you can read like a kind of Kondratiev wave, which continually recurs throughout the 19th and 20th century. Every 30 to 40 years or so, you have an indophiliac surge, and then it dips, and then it surfaces, and then it submerges. So the project is really a kind of encounter with the kind of ambivalence of utopian socialisms. In the way you describe it, there's a dimension of critique, but there's also a dimension of fascination with their fascination. Like
this was the Pasolini.
The texture of fascination. There's a certain sinisterness, and there's a certain sense to create, trying to use music and text and image to create a certain sense of awe, and even fear in a way, without necessarily knowing what it is you're apprehensive of. And so, and that work is a kind of encounter with all of those simultaneous dynamics, I think.
And also the fact that all these images are also album covers or record sleeves, which kind of reminds you of the importance of the music.
Yeah, so that's I mean, those are records that are, you know, some of them are mine, some of them are Anjali's. There, both are record collections, and there is something that the scripto-visual dimension of seeing those magnified, I find very, very effective. It's very, very powerful. And it was fascinating to us because it seemed to be the guitar heroes who had everything, the Carlos Santanas and the Pete Townsend, and suddenly you'd have this moment where these figures would be opting for what we call a kind of post-Christian belonging. It's as if they'd you know, capitalism had provided everything, but it wasn't enough, and now the turn to the gurus was a search for a kind of authority figure.
No, they were like computers. They connected you to a kind of interweb of consciousness. That's how they saw it. And I mean, I think of gurus as early computers, you know. But the sorry? Oh, yeah. But I mean, the thing is that, you know, the Indian-ness, the Indophilia, the fascination with with India, you know, in California is a whole other story. But, you know, at least at that time, it wasn't this term mindfulness makes me vomit, you know. I hate it more than anything else. And all these people kind of doing their ohms and their mindfulness to be more efficient slaves to late capitalism. I mean, I cannot bear it. It is the most sort of, you know, all of that has got worse. Like, at least then there was some sort of sense of like, oh, we are connecting with the kind of interconscious web in order to produce kind of a world community that is going to change the world, you know. Yeah. Now it's, you know, just about the self, you know.
Also, records are kind of an interconnective. I mean, they travel the world and they connect people through music. But just to move on, so I tried to prepare for this conversation. I typed Otolith group in Google Scholar, and all I got was a bunch of articles about the inner ear, and I read a little bit of it, and I learned that the otolith is like the inner part of your ear that perceives linear acceleration, which means that when you move your head, the sound actually changes. And I thought, oh, that's makes sense, because at least these three films all feel like they're kind of a reaction to sound in some ways. So you have like the record labels in the record sleeves in the first one, and then you have sound, which is an important component of at least all of the work I've seen that you've made. So I'm just wondering if you would want to talk about that, how you work, like would you,
But, I mean, Otolith comes from our first film where we did 6 hours of training to become cosmonauts. And we performed parabolic flights, and we liked the term Otolith because it stopped us, people asking us where we were from all the time, and allowed people to ask us about what an otolith was. So it's still working. And it actually came from the idea in Superman Superman films have had quite a profound influence on my life, but Superman and the Fortress of Solitude, it's true. Like, it'll be in a book one day. but the Fortress of Solitude in Superman, where all these crystals are kind of sprouting. Kojo and I both kind of love this destabilizing geo kind of mantic world, which we imagined was like the inside of our inner ears, which, yes, it actually maintaining balance in zero gravity means looking at a horizon line. Not maintaining balance, stopping you from being sick, because when you're in zero gravity, the cosmonauts just come up to you and say, if you're sick, be sick in this bag, don't give it to cosmonauty. I'm like, okay, so I'm going to be sick in this. So the best thing to do is to avoid being sick. So the idea was that you looked at a horizon line, and this kept the crystals, these fine crystals, in some sort of balance. But I think it also gave us a sort of axis upon which to think about ourselves as geological figures, and think about time in relation to the stone of the ear, as opposed to the kind of categories imposed upon us.
I think, or did you want to add it?
No.
Okay. So, if we talk about the next film, Hydra Capita, which is also a work that centers around the Detroit techno duo Drexia, and they have this myth, like connected to the album The Quest. They have we learned that Drexia is an imagined underwater country populated from the unborn children of pregnant women who were thrown overboard from slave ships and across the Atlantic during the slave trade. And this fiction is an example of how people or artists create from the state of not belonging, from dislocation. For example, if you live with the legacy of slave trade, then your vision of future, it can't be like built from past, because your past is very fragmented, and you need to kind of use imaginations from history. And it feels like that's also what you're doing in this work, where you have, like you said, Angelica, like you're challenging this perception of time, which is more linear, and you have the story of the ship from 1781, the song, and then you have the Turner painting, but then you also have these recordings from probably a different time. So I'm curious about how this works. This work reflects your perception of time.
Thank you. That's several key questions, but maybe one way through them all, and a way to connect to all the works. In a way, you actually don't learn much about the song. It's just a sentence, you know. Maybe you don't learn that much about Drexia from this work. You don't learn that much about the slave trade. So that I think the part of the... So, what, you know, you use historical material, but the aim is not to make a historical film. The aim is not even necessarily to provide you with knowledge or information or insight. These days, when I look at the work, it strikes me as apophatic. It moves via negation. It's taking a lot of things out, and it's doing a lot of things without explaining them. the work, it's as much about sitting with not knowing and with non-knowing. So there's a kind of apophatic aesthetics at play. And I think music is very good at that. Music is, in Raymond Williams' sense, music emerges at the limits of the semantic. So music appears at the point at which words, music appear at the borders between sense and nonsense, between words and non-words, at the border. So, of course, there were many voices. Anjali sings, John Ruskin throughout. But there were several types of sound and several types of music running through. And, in a way, I think the idea is to invite you into a state of not quite knowing what it is you're listening to, or who is speaking, and even what they're saying, or what the object is, and to in a way create a certain hermetic world, which is partly not shutting you out, but is partly making it difficult for you to access, so that you have to go to it, and you have to want to initiate yourself in it. And this, and so you're searching for clues for how to understand what it is you're looking at. And if you find them, then you stay with it. And if you don't, then you get thrown out of it. And I think music is good at moving on this line between the hermetic and the hermeneutic. Music provides the clue to things, but music is also this kind of code that you're trying to elucidate, even as it continually encodes itself.
But also the film has, the soundscape of the film has like very abrupt cuts. So it does have a continuity, because it has repetitions, and if you're looking for clues, then you can go back the next time you hear something similar, like the second time you hear Angelica singing, then you kind of maybe say that, oh, it's a description of a painting, or you can hear like the signals and what they're actually saying, the countdown and the numbers. But the cuts are also pretty abrupt. It feels like it's still kind of fragmented in a way, which, yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, the fragmentation, yes, I like Kojo's description, watching it in relation to a kind of series of negations, because what happened after we made that was that every cliche in the book kind of emerges around, I don't know, superheroes, the sea. We don't, I don't want to be mean, but, there's like a lot of... the internet itself produces this homogenized obsession with certain cliches in art, like octopuses or whatever. There was quite a few cliches that kind of emerged around figuration. And the last thing we wanted to do was kind of have big, muscly kind of Drexians, because the album covers and themselves are quite minimal. But then Ruskin himself was, part of, the anti-slave movement in the UK, as was Turner. These were good men. But Ruskin, also when he was writing about the painting by Turner, there was no printed image, so they're very descriptive words. These terms, Carradine. So I found that this added to the kind of the lack of an image, the purposeful lack of the purposeful desire to not have any kind of human figuration, but to have the remnants of vocalities and a voice is somehow emerging kind of on the surface of the water, which begins to look like code. And that kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. My next question was actually about the lack of figurative images in the film, and wait, I'll just, because you told me that you can speak about the nucleus of the Grey Union forever, so
Yes.
I'm just gonna check.
I can restrain
I'm
myself.
just gonna check the time.
I'm trying hard to rein myself in.
So we don't have forever, but we do have 12 minutes, 10 minutes. And I think it's quite interesting with the combination of these three films that, so you have the kind of an iconic, like the lack of images in Hideout to Capita, but in the next one you are completely filled, it's a very obvious contrast where you're filled with images. And I think it kind of connects to the first film again, where it's like witnessing someone decoding visual information, visual culture in a way. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that film, the background for that work.
I mean, it is a visual study in the way that Nicole Brenes, who I think is really one of the, is probably the film theorist who I find most useful. Nicole Brenes. Brené. So she has this notion of visual study, which is studying the image by way of the image, setting up a figurative project through which you study an image in order to elucidate what its powers are, what its forces are, what it can be, what it might be, what it's capable of. The kind of the possible forms and faces and fictions of an image. And so this notion of visual study is really, it's a very useful one, and that's part of what's at stake in this work. Richard Wright travels to the Gold Coast in 1953 in order to witness the so-called motion of destiny, which is a particular political act which sets in motion independence, which still takes another 4 years. And he takes all these photographs, all of which are at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. Some of them are in his book Black Power, but only a small number. And so clearly the nucleus of the Great Union is a kind of study of those photographs insofar as we could access them. So that's the most immediate way of understanding what's going on in that work. But clearly there's an effort to make historical images perform in non-historical ways. In fact, to mobilize images, to get them to travel and to get them to circulate in the space of video, in the space of animation, in the space of study, so that you create different choreographies and different opportunities for study outside of the history of photography or art history, or outside of the disciplinary terms upon which one would tend to look at those photographs. So to create encounters that are not necessarily legible under disciplinary terms. So to create some kind of unbounded, some kind of temporally unbounded environment in which these images can perform under other skies, under other forces, and can be invited to speak to us in terms other than the ones in which they've been conscripted to speak.
Yeah, because when you use that form of, like, I don't know if it's called spatial montaging, like you put different images on top of each other and next to each other within the same frame, which probably wasn't possible before, then you kind of create this logic for the viewer to compare them, or bring out like the contrasts and the similarities and associations in the images. And I caught myself now thinking that this clip with the file format conversion, which was failing, and then you had the Paul Gilroy quote in the end with misunderstood intellectual. It somehow like started associating that kind of like technical failure with a misunderstanding in the quote. So you kind of bring out these associations.
Was there a Gilroy quote?
It's
Yeah,
Edward
it's,
Kamau Brathwaite.
You mean?
It's a Gilroy quote about Richard Wright in the.
Okay, yes, maybe yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, Gilroy is a big fan of Wright. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, that's that kind of contrasting of images is quite interesting with work, and I'm wondering if there were any like intentional combinations that you worked with when you worked with it.
I mean, you can see that the middle section is very much engaged with Saidiya Hartman's second book, Lose Your Mother, because it's Saidiya Hartman who is, in a way, continuing, extending, and maybe even bringing to an end a tradition really pioneered by Richard Wright, in which African American intellectuals go to the continent in order to stage an inquiry between those who were enslaved and those who weren't. So this is an inquiry between ethnogenesis, the becoming black of the enslaved African person, and ontogenesis, what it means to be black. And Richard Wright in a way really pioneers that. He does that in the, so Black Power is really pioneering, and you can open a vector between Richard Wright in the early 50s and Saidiya Hartman in 2007 with Lose Your Mother. That is an ongoing tradition of inquiry that the video wants to stage. And then at the end, the encounter with Edward Kamau Brathwaite, that's the moment of a kind of Caribbean technopoetics. Brathwaite from Barbados, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, who lived in Ghana for several years. And his trilogy of his great trilogy of poems, The Arrivants, Masks, Rites of Passage, that poem that we draw upon again creates a kind of it dramatizes the state of subjectivity, or it dramatizes the biography of modernity that African subjects, West African subjects, faced, and so it's about creating a larger spatial or even non-spatial way of thinking through these photographs, in which their obvious historicity is being opened up to some kind of void, so that you're forced rather than assuming the historical valence, rather than assuming that you know what these figures are doing and what they refer to and what they're thinking. You're forced to watch them confront you across this digital void of darkness, and then of green, and then of, you know, these different non-spaces. I was struck by the first work. Everything is fading out of white and coming out of white, and in this one, everything is coming out of green and going into darkness. You know, and that's because these we call it the key to the chromatic kingdom. If you have these non-colors, they provide this vast canvas upon which historical documents take on this kind of an archival dimension. I think it's the idea to treat archival images in ways that are not immediately archival. The desire to treat historical images in ways in which they are not historically bound to their historical context. To create a temporal unboundedness while simultaneously articulating their historical emergence, to have both going on simultaneously. And so this is what we call the intertemporal. It's the movement between times, that a time that is unbounded, a time that is historically situated, and often music and sound is the intertemporal vehicle that helps you go back and forth between a time of no time and a time which is historically dated. So it's about opening up the relations between chronology, history, temporality, and memory. It's about disarticulating all of those. Traditional documentary will try to collapse those upon each other, but actually they are open to disarticulation, such that we begin to ask questions about that relation, and we want to hold people in that space of questioning about those fundamental questions.
Was there? Yeah. Did you want to say anything?
No, I mean, I also think that one is, like many leftists from, within the empire, from the kind of late 1800s, 1900s, betrayed the possessive nationalism of imperialism with solidarity with foreigners or with others, with people, who are supposed to be alleged inferiors. This, I think is where Richard Wright is kind of thinks he's coming from, but yet he goes to Ghana in a safari hat and takes these rather bad photographs, and then there is.
I don't think they're all bad.
No, they're not all bad, but they're quite. Anyway. Sad. I mean, they're very they're quite melancholic. I mean, they're definitely like projecting his image of Ghana, and then you have Saidia's image, and I think these are very.
And then Brathwaite.
And then Brathwaite, who is my favourite, really. But these. I think we have these. Betrayals going on with the idea of belonging anywhere, which is the power of the diaspora, which is why white fundamentalists, nationalists are so scared of the likes of us, because we know a lot about back home and we know a lot about here. And this kind of betrayal is what, we were kind of, I think, exploring as a structure of feeling.
Yeah. Now that you have seen these three films together, do you have any thoughts on how they relate to each other?
I think this question of temporal and boundedness I think that's part of what.
And betrayal of, yeah.
Yeah, I think this idea of a diaspora of images,
Yeah.
that images themselves are migrants. Well, images themselves undergo migritude. Images are subject to migritude, and they are themselves migrants. There's another work, People to be Resembling, about the great group Cadona, and there the migrant aesthetics is foregrounded. Every Cadona song is clearly migrant, because every Cadona composition, because to bring together, you know, a Dusungoni from Mali with North Indian scales,
Yeah.
with, you know, with a Turkish oud, that in itself requires a huge amount of migrant inter-articulation to do that work. And Cadona did that kind of continually. So I think this notion of temple unboundedness, which is a kind of temporal freedom, is related to this question of a kind of how to think a migrant aesthetics. And it's related to this question of an apophatic aesthetics, an aesthetics that moves via way of negation and withdrawal, as much as it does by explanation or elucidation. I think you can see these operations at work, but in different ways, because each project requires some kind of immanent method.
Yeah.
You have to draw the method out of the works. You can't apply a pre-existing method to the works, because otherwise then you won't have a work.
It's like a cinematic world building almost. I mean, they talk about it when you did, like in the films you described, like Superman, but it also applies to more experimental works like this, where you have to kind of build the logic within the film. And I think that's when we open up for the audience to ask questions.
Yeah, post-cinematic world building. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, any questions from the audience? Yeah, two. I think you were first and then you, and I think there's a microphone coming your way.
Hi.
Thanks for coming all the way to Norway. I just had a question. Yeah, I had a question about this. Actually, you used the word again now of apophatic cinema, and not to pit you against Sylvia Hartman, but there's a technique. I feel that a lot of the work that you do is your historiographers disguised as movie makers, and you actually said it again now, this idea that the subject of your work forces you to make movies in a way, but if you were to do something else, you would actually have to change media. There's something very intriguing there, this idea of apophatic historiography, that actually the only way to properly say that story is to ignore certain parts and misunderstand something purposefully.
Yeah, thank you. I think obviously the apophatic is usually used in terms of religion. It's usually about, you know, speaking of God through the terms that God is not. So I'm not using it in a specifically religious sense, but clearly I think when you make work, you're making apophatic decisions all the time. At the level of editing, that's obviously apophatic, because editing is the necessary removal, you know. And that's at the most obvious level, but in a way, there's a kind of confrontation with the presence of what is missing in the work, where you can sense what we've removed in order to, and that's what I mean by the apophatic, where you can sense the negative agency at work, in the work, the agency of negation, and that's important to us because, I mean, yes, we have an interest in the historiographic, but I wouldn't say we're especially good historians. I respect historians too much to claim that we are doing historiography. I'd say we're doing things with history that are not especially historical. So in that sense, we're actually, incomplete. We're kind of we're necessarily incomplete. We're doing a necessarily incomplete historiography. That's how I'd put it. If only because, there were great historiographers, and I don't much respect a kind of the mastery of historiography, the claim to mastery or totality. I mean, the impact of Sadiq Hartman is because faced with the absences within the archive, the impact of the inherent violence of the archive is then foregrounded through critical fabulation, which does a kind of damage to the status of what a historical event is. So you're not actually sure. Sadiq Hartman writes in the conditional tense, so you're not quite sure the status of what it is she's writing about. Did those things happen or not? So instead of trying to resolve the absences of the archive, she's trying to exacerbate the problems that the archive poses. She's trying to make things worse for history, in a sense. And to that, and that's something we've learned from her work. That sense of not resolving and not recuperating or repairing histories or archives, but exacerbating the problems they pose for us now. Thank you. That was a great question.
Hi. I wanted to ask you, so immediately after this last film, or maybe not immediately, but maybe 2 years after, you're working with the idea of simultaneity and with the work of Octavia Butler and Julius Eastman, like how connecting this like impossibility or this irony of, on the one side, not being able to give a structure to your own past or the past of your own family, and at the same time, like with these texts where they said, like, I wish my ancestors, my fathers were slaves, so then I could be a great man. And then you go then to work with Eastman and Butler, like these two world builders, and the idea of the necessity of being an alien of yourself. And so my question is, what are you working now in like this connection of these works, and what are your problems that you are working together now?
Hi there. I think we've been in touch on. Are you Soto? I can't pronounce. Yes. Anyway, nice to meet you finally. I don't think we are ever. I think we're working on the same thing all the time in different ways. And from the first work, Otolith 1 onwards, they are I think they're experiments in alienation and self-alienating, and thinking about alienating oneself from all that is known due to historical or political events, the forced nature of how that produces an alienness, but also how that potentially produces a oneness with others, or, you know, with a kind of movement through different worlds. So I've been thinking a lot about how things are feeling more and more homogenized, and I've been thinking a lot about the inheritance of what Eurasia is and could be, and what Eurafrica is or could be. Not so much in terms of wanting to make a big, you know, grand project around those ideas, but more in terms of how poetics might travel, and how vocalities might become possessed with certain poetics. I think that xenogenesis Octavia Butler wasn't someone we came to when we titled our exhibition Xenogenesis. We've been, Kojo certainly has been thinking with Octavia Butler for long before Otolith. And so actually has my little sister. So there has been a kind of interest in Butler for so many years. I don't think that we are, and I'll repeat it, we're not working on something necessarily new. We're just working again with similar ideas and thinking about them in different ways. Now we're working on a project which is opening in Chicago next week on the films of Djibril Diop Mambéty and Ousmane Sembène. But I would say in that work there is a lot of influence from within that work of the last 3 films actually that we've watched.
Yeah, these are the visual studies. One takes the form of a mural, a large-scale mural. Another is in moving image work.
From the mural.
Yeah, so it's a kind of sequel to the mural. So I've been working on 2 works all year. And these are, what happens when you take certain figures, certain geometries, certain geographies, certain expressions, and take them out from the narratives from which they emerged, and bring them into a borderless landscape, a kind of constructed landscape, and get them to speak differently. So there are relations. That's the notion of a borderless imagination is not unrelated to the notion of a temporal unboundedness, and so that's very much influenced again by Nicole Bernays, by the work of there's this brilliant book that we like, an exhausting book called Corpi e Luoghi, Bodies and Spaces, by Mancini and Perella, 2 Italian curators from the 80s who went through all of Pasolini's films and who catalogued all of Pasolini's films in terms of typologies. And they did this on the Steenbeck, so it took them 4 or 5 years. So there's like a page of men laughing with missing teeth. There's a page of women sneezing. There's a page of children looking in windows. There's a page of men pissing. And so it's like 450 pages. I've never got to the end of it. It's totally exhausting. But it's this fascinating project, which Haroon Froggy told us about, in which you recompose a body of films according to, I mean, we would call them tropes, but actually they are more like, more like movement gesture complexes. It's like a rediscovery of Abby Warburg's pathos formula. And so that's very influential on us. We have both the Italian version and the English translation, and we sit there, open it, look through it, and then put it down exhausted because it's such a huge and epic volume. But that idea is one that informs a lot of what we do, although you wouldn't see a direct correlation. You wouldn't look at Korpi Luogi and go, aha, I see what you're doing there. It's not one-to-one, it's not illustration, but it is animating the work. And that goes back to, there's a work, Otolith 3 from '09, which brings together many films by Satyajit Ray and by Mrinal Sen and recomposes them around an unmade film.
Called The Alien.
So this idea of getting characters from different films to talk to each other and getting them to communicate in an unbounded temporal landscape, that's somehow very important to us.
But I do think we have to be, I mean, I love this phrase that Kamal Brathwaite uses in his poem at the end, in the Arrivants, when he says this term, rhinocerously mute, to describe the present. We have to, I think about this term, rhinocerously mute. I think a lot of the terms on which we made art before have completely changed since October the 7th and over the last year. And in different ways, there is a looming horror. And I think...
surely it's already here.
It's already here, yeah. It's just getting worse. But I suppose making work within that is helps you to stay somewhat sane.
Yeah, I mean, the work is you're creating communities of unbelonging. Because you're literally taking figures from works and putting them into relation with each other outside of their settings. So clearly that aesthetic operation is our way of, is an aesthetic politics right there. We want to be in community with people who don't feel themselves to belong to communities, people who have an ambivalence with communities, people who struggle with that, and we think many people have this experience, and that's one element about what guides the decisions and the choices we make. So when we don't go to Octavia Butler or Julius Eastman because because we think they are especially fashionable. It's because we sense an awkwardness and a capacity for disappointment in their work. Octavia Butler, all her life, faced people saying to her, what is the point of writing science fiction? People said that to her whole life. Even after she'd won the MacArthur Award. People, what is the point of writing science fiction? You know, same with Julius Eastman. People go, well, what is the point of being a black composer? You know, you're writing compositions that no black people have no interest in. What are you doing it for? You know, and so those kinds of questions, those questions that people bring to the work, the kinds of the forms of certainty people have about what it is they think you're doing when you do work that has a degree of abstraction to it, or a degree of non-figuration, or a degree of noise. We're drawn to those characters who did not solve those questions. They inhabited them. Julius Eastman didn't solve this question. He lived it. And that's what we're drawn to. Octavia Butler could never answer this question, what is the use of science fiction? But she lived it through her furor scribendi, her will to write, her passion to write. And this is what's important.
I think we actually don't have time for another question unless someone has a really short. Who's first? Okay, very short question from you.
Take both of them.
Yeah, if it's okay for you, we can.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for an interesting conversation. And she really loved the first one and the third one. But I would just want to say the second one, which was the one I found most mysterious, how mysterious as the sea is. And also I've been a big fan of Drexia, the Detroit techno group for ages. But and also I've been following Claude Visual's writing for quite a long time also, through books and everything. But can you explain a bit more about what that film was about?
That's a fair question.
How long do you have?
Okay, I'll give
a long
you
answer to a short question.
I'll give you 1 minute. No.
I can't do that kind of time-space compression that you're calling for. You know, I don't have my time-space compressor. I don't know where it is. I left it. So, I mean, there's a long answer to that, but unfortunately, we don't have time to get into it now. The short answer is that it's not designed, as you know, it's not an explanation of Drexciya. It's a further mystification of Drexciya. So the mystery that you experienced is part of the point. Subsequent people, many people have worked with Drexciya, and there is this desire almost to explain Drexciya away, as if you can hold it in your hand and grasp it, and now you've got it. No, create a mystery and pass that on, so that other people can participate in that mystery.
But there's a part 2 now.
Yeah, that's true.
I just saw Rob.
Yeah, so the whole point of the film is for you to live with that question. Yeah, okay, so the final question was... No, you, yeah.
Easy. Yeah, you mentioned the Koji, you mentioned the like cultural kind of
A familiar voice.
Anyway, we'll get to that. But kind of interested in terms of, you were talking about things going in waves.
Oh, yes.
Just kind of wondered where you thought we were, or in the UK, in terms of what's happened in the last month.
Oh, yeah.
Whether that's a swing back to what we saw in the 70s or 80s, or like something from other areas.
What do you think? Yeah, it's indophobia for sure. It's not indophilia, that's for sure.
All kinds of phobias activated
Multiple-
by
multiple phobias, yeah.
multiple phobias. It's 14 years of Tories and austerity. It's the complete destruction of the National Health Service, of the welfare state, of the educational system, and the replacement. You know, it's kind of, I mean, Musk and all the bullshit that they send out on that Twitter, whatever, X. Twitter, you know.
X-Twatter.
You know,
Twitter, Twatter,
they
X,
mobilize
Twatter.
this kind of riotous discontent. But on the other hand, what was good, and I don't know if it's good because I'm sort of interested in this term hypermaxing at the moment, like these kind of extreme like expressions of certain various different things. But anyway, this event, you're talking about the event of all these groups, these mobs attacking people. I mean, I'm scared to go out of London now, you know. I've, you know, even said to people I know who are white, if you feel like coming with us on a holiday so we can walk our dog somewhere, hiking somewhere, then we'd be very happy to have our to go with you, because I now feel quite scared. I know why it's happened. It's obvious why it's happened. There's so much misinformation. Of course, seeing a genocide broadcast onto your phone has just produced the sense that violence is okay, that killing is okay, it's all fine. But also how these events have then acted as a license for misinterpretation, and for, you know, the right wing to kind of use these events to just create more violence is also happening. So I think we're seeing a kind of new form of mob activation, which is produced through techno-fascism. And that's new. I would say it's not. Maybe it isn't new. Maybe it's been present in different ways. But this has been so driven by misinformation. I think the response to it now is important, because Keir Starmer just chucking everyone in overcrowded jails obviously isn't the answer. If this Der Starmer, as we call him, could actually invest in local neighbourhoods and put money into those parts of the country which require sort of housing and which, you know, are really depressed, that might change things. Who knows if they will? They are repeating austerity measures which are not, you know. So what else is happening in the UK? I mean, you know, everyone gets an OBE who's black, or, you know, that's fine. You get an OBE, you get a MBE, and life is good, you know. I think there is
It's not fine.
It's not fine. I think there is a bit of a kind of, you know, memory culture thing going on with the 80s. And actually the last 20, 30, 25 years since 9/11 has transformed everything. And I think Britain isn't very good and never has been good, and our institutions have never been good at having discourse-led environments. They have never done that. The most important exhibitions have never come to the UK. So I think there's a lot going on, but that's a basic, quick answer.
Before we round up, I just wanted to ask you to give a quick 1-minute pitch of tomorrow's event, because you're also here for Ultima Festival.
Yes, that's true. I mean, in the morning I'll be in conversation with Gary Stewart and Trevor Matheson of Dub Morphology, who are a very important duo if you know their work. If you don't, you should. And the producer and musician and artist Nkisi. So we'll be in conversation. And then in the evening, Gary and Trevor will be playing music, and I'm going to be reading notes from a manifesto that I've been writing. So that'll be in the evening. So those are two different events to watch out for tomorrow. I understand there's a lot going on, but
yeah, and that the last one is at Henny Onsdag for also people. So yeah, thank you so much to both of you, to Angelica and Kodjo. I'm really, really happy you made it to Oslo, and I'm really looking forward to tomorrow.
well, thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.